Okay, so this is your Project 2 video on Classical Mesoamerica. I hope you have your study guide out and that you take good notes and answer those study guide questions as we go. Also remember our SPICE graphic organizer as a way of organizing your information and notes and ideas from this lecture. So let's begin. Right, Classical Mesoamerica, meso meaning middle, America meaning America, right? So classical Mesoamerica is the lands that we now call Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua. That's classical Mesoamerica, and most of our focus will be on the lands that are now called Southern Mexico. If you've already watched the Roman Empire lecture and the Han China lecture, you've seen views of civilizations that are very detailed and very organized and very focused. And that's because the Romans and the Chinese left tons of records, written records, artifacts, buildings. And the classical Mesoamericans left a lot of those things as well, but they're not as unified. They're not as organized, and finding information about classical Mesoamerica is more challenging. Right? The very early civilizations like the Olmecs were not literate people, so they did not leave written records. Also, the written records that were left by the Mayans are not all the way understood yet. We have these so-called Mayan glyphs, which were a system of writing and record keeping, and we're starting to understand those very well, but we're not all the way there yet. In fact, if you're interested in history and interested in languages and interested in Mesoamerica, there's a ton of work that is waiting to be done in this area, right? Being a historian of classical Rome can be difficult because there's not a lot left to do. Most of the history has been done. But when we look at classical Mesoamerica, there's still a lot of history to do. There's still a lot of work ahead of us. And so it's a wonderful opportunity if you're interested in this area. I'm sorry, I digress for a moment. Also, the wet climate of the Yucatan, right? This rich, wet, jungly area. A lot of the material things that were left behind by particularly the Maya have simply rotted away, and so that can also present a challenge for finding evidence. So you'll notice that this lecture is a little less cohesive, and what I want to do is take a very broad view of these civilizations at first, and then take a look at the characteristics of these civilizations that they shared, and try to give you a sense of unity among groups of people who had very different experiences in some cases. The other challenge with this lecture is the challenge of periodization, right? Periodization refers to the way in which historians divide up periods. Now, in this class, each project is a period of world history, and we are going to work with periodization more as the year goes on and you develop a better sense of history. But for right now, I want you to notice a lot of the dates in this lecture, and you're going to notice that what we refer to as classical Mesoamerica happens a lot later than what we refer to as classical China or classical Rome. And that is because of the geography. That is because the Eastern Hemisphere, which includes the Roman Empire and Han China, the Eastern Hemisphere was populated by humans much earlier. We get a lot more diffusion of culture and a lot more early human experiences. And those things will happen in Mesoamerica, but they will happen later, right? People reach Mesoamerica later, they start later, and so they tend to run a little bit later, even though they're going through the same experiences that the peoples of the Eastern Hemisphere had. And remember also that periodization is always historically debatable. Right? Periods are created by humans. Humans like to argue about ideas. And so, what we may call classical Mesoamerica could be argued by historians. But I want you to keep all that in mind because, again, a lot of this will become very important later in the course. All right, so let's look at the civilizations, right? The first great Mesoamerican civilization was the Olmecs. who were at the height of their power between 1500 and 400 BCE. So even earlier than the Roman Republic. This was quite early, and they became very powerful in the eastern and southeastern lowlands of Mexico, along the Gulf of Mexico. The other civilization that we're going to look at here are the Maya, and they inhabited kind of some of the same lands as the Olmecs, a little bit further south on the so-called Yucatan Peninsula, and their areas reached down into modern El Salvador, so quite a bit further south than the Olmecs. And the Mayans are still there, right? We still have Mayan tribes who speak Mayan languages, and they remain throughout southern Mexico and the northern parts of Central America. So while the Mayan Confederacy fell apart, as we're going to see later in this lecture, the Mayans are still there and doing quite well. The other civilization that I want you to be aware of is the Empire of Teotihuacan. And so they were at their most powerful between 300 and 900 CE, and they inhabited the central highlands of Mexico, in the so-called Valley of Mexico, which is northeast of what would become the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. And so really just think modern-day Mexico City, right? And you see a map down there. If you know where Mexico City is within Mexico, then that's, the general area of the Empire of Teotihuacan. The next major group, and again, this is a highlands people, so again, think Mexico City, don't think jungles like the Maya, were the Toltecs. And the Toltecs took over that region after the decline of Teotihuacan. They used that city, they used that region and those buildings and that technology. That was just, the Toltecs were the dominant group in the Valley of Mexico at that time. And so the final group we're going to look at, and probably the group you're most familiar with from this region, are the Aztecs, right? Oftentimes when we think about classical Mesoamerican civilizations or pre-Columbian, right, before Columbus civilizations, we think of the Aztecs. And we often forget that the Aztec Empire didn't last very long. They were really only at the height of their power for about 170 years. But they inhabited the highlands as well, Valley of Mexico. Their great capital of Tenochtitlan is the modern capital of Mexico City. And the Aztecs started out as nomadic raiders, the so-called Mexica, who likely came from the north, possibly as far north as modern-day San Diego or Los Angeles. And they were nomadic raiders who settled at Tenochtitlan and eventually developed military alliances with some of the local tribes to form this larger imperial confederacy. And they were very powerful, and you can see that their lands included the former lands of the Olmecs and even as far south as the Mayan lands. These people were tough, and a great empire, but eventually they fell to Cortez's Spanish forces in 1591. All right, so again, we've taken a brief, broad, fast survey of the major Mesoamerican peoples. Let's look at some of their common civilizational features, as well as some things that are unique to certain groups. Right, so Mesoamerican STEM, right, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Right, Mesoamerican STEM was really based on superb mathematics. The Mayans especially were amazing mathematicians. And out of those mathematical abilities, they had some phenomenal architecture, right? Their engineering skills were very powerful. Also, later on in the Aztec Empire, these very sophisticated water delivery systems to deliver water from the mountains around Tenochtitlan down into the city, which was on an island in the middle of a lake, but they needed fresh water because the lake water wasn't really good for that purpose. And also astronomy, which was particularly important for the Mayans because it was the stars and the movements of the stars that dictated their lives and their religious rituals, and a lot of their political organization was based on astronomy, which again comes back to mathematics. These people were amazing mathematicians. right? So part of that stem is, the building of these fantastic pyramids, which are a common feature of all the Mesoamerican civilizations. Right. So again, we're looking at this notion of monumental architecture and what monumental architecture does for a civilization and what it shows us about a civilization. And of course, these pyramids have a very distinctive style. Very often, when we think about these Mesoamerican peoples, we think about those large flat top pyramids with the stairs going up the sides. And again, these pyramids represented a very major mobilization of resources and sacrifice, right? Labor and money and tax money to build. And again, they provide a very important social center for these people. These are places of political display, places of religious display, and in Mesoamerican culture, those are very often the same thing. A place of civic pride, a place of community pride, right? To have a large, beautiful pyramid, right? And that's one of the things that to note that Teotihuacan was known for was some of the biggest and most impressive pyramids. And so again, pyramids are a key representation of Mesoamerican STEM as well as monumental architecture. Right, governmental technique for most of the Mesoamerican states was based a lot on tribute states. Now, tribute is money given to a ruler, right? So I may come defeat your people, and I will say, I'm not going to enslave you. I'm not going to take your land. I'm not going to kill all your people. I'm going to conquer you, and then every year you're going to give me $1 million. And as long as you give me $1 million every year, I will leave you alone. And if the $1 million doesn't come, then I'm coming back to your lands and, gonna teach you a thing or two. So, governmental technique, especially for the Aztecs, was based on tribute states. The idea was that one went and conquered, so that way the conquered peoples would be a source of income. Also, these Mesoamerican peoples fought wars to get human sacrifices. Right, to the Mesoamericans, their gods demanded human sacrifice, blood, and the removal of hearts, as we'll see as a part of this project. And so very often these wars were fought not to kill the opponent, but to capture the opponent and bring him back to one city to be sacrificed at the top of these pyramids. And these were the so-called flowery wars. Land management was an important characteristic of particularly the lowland coastal peoples like the Olmecs and the Maya. Because they have such dense jungles, they relied a lot on slash and burn agriculture, which was, where you go through and you burn down an entire forest, and that's how you clear the land. And it actually created great fertility because the charred remains of all the burnt plant life provide very good fertilizer. But the deforestation caused huge problems, particularly for the Maya, because once all the plant life is gone, then when the heavy rains come, it washes the soil away. So while the land would be very fertile after these slash and burn periods for a year or two, over the period of 5 to 10 years, that land would just become wrecked and virtually worthless. And so the people would have to go do another slash and burn. And you can see how this would exhaust the land very quickly, right? If you've taken environmental science, you're probably thinking, my God, this is a horrible thing to do. And indeed, it was not the wisest way of managing one's land. And so this leads us to some of the causes of collapse for these Mesoamerican cultures. Now, for the Maya particularly, they simply exceeded their carrying capacity. There were too many people on too little land, and the agricultural practices were sketchy. And so this led to, the collapse of the Maya. Contrary to what most people believe, the Maya didn't disappear, right? They didn't get into rocket ships and sail off with the aliens like some people say on weird History Channel shows. The Maya are still there. It's just that they became disorganized and their city-states collapsed, but then the people kind of just returned to the jungle. But again, they're still there. Whereas for the highlands people, very often they fell to warfare. These tribute wars, these flowery wars became very large. And so, we get the succession of Teotihuacan, the Toltecs, the Aztecs, and finally the Spanish. It's warfare that causes the collapse of those Mesoamerican peoples. Now let's take a moment and talk about geography and trade, because as I said earlier in the lecture, the Mesoamericans, by and large, started their civilizations later, and so that's why we see different levels of development and different periodization among these people. We also have some very large barriers to trade for these Mesoamerican peoples, right? Mesoamerica is a very rich, fertile, wonderful place to set up a civilization, but it's kind of cut off. To the north, you have the deserts of the southwestern United States and northern Mexico, right through the states of Texas, Chihuahua, Sonora, Baja Norte, Southern California, Nevada, right? Those are not good places to set up large civilizations because you can't have a lot of agriculture, and so therefore you can't have the agricultural surpluses, and so therefore you can't have the big, powerful, complex civilization like we are going to see in the lowlands or in the Valley of Mexico. Also, there's a large southern barrier for Mesoamerica, and that's just because the Isthmus of Panama, there in Panama, southern Nicaragua, is very narrow. It's very hot, very wet. It's a hard place to set up a civilization that's particularly large. And so there's a southern barrier to expansion. And so Mesoamerica is kind of sandwiched between these geographic barriers. And so while within Mesoamerica, trade was very rich and complex and sophisticated, long-range trade would not develop between Mexico and the Northeast, what would become the Northeastern United States. Trade would not develop between, what we call Mexico and what we call South America. Those would not develop in this time period. So again, trade was highly localized. It was successful and rich, but it was not very long distance like it was for the Chinese and the Romans. Also, we have this interesting feature about the Earth's surface, and that is, for the Eastern Hemisphere, the long line is east-west, right? We can grow kind of the same crops in Spain as we can in China because they lie along the same line of latitude. And if you recall, we talked about this in the first project when we looked at some maps in class. Whereas for the Americas, right, the Western Hemisphere, the long line is north-south. And so you can't take a crop that grows in Ohio and replant it in Panama. It's just not going to grow. It's going to die. We can take crops that grow really well in Ohio and replant them in Argentina. And again, I'm using the modern names for these areas, not the traditional classical names. We can take something that grows really well in Ohio and replant it in Argentina, but those people didn't have contact. The early Ohioan Native Americans, the people of Cahokia and places like that, they're not talking to the Inca. They don't have that contact. And so we also have some big geographic limitations to trade and the diffusion of crops and animals because of the geography of the Western Hemisphere. So we want to keep that in mind when we say, why is there this big Silk Road in the Eastern Hemisphere? Why isn't there anything like that in the Western Hemisphere? A lot of that comes back to geography. All right, so let's take a look at social mobility within Mesoamerican peoples, right? Again, social mobility is the ability to move up and become wealthier, more powerful. For the Mesoamericans, like the Romans, that social mobility is based on warfare, becoming a great warrior and capturing people and capturing wealth from other people and, setting up these tribute systems. Also, sport was a major way to move up in Mesoamerican civilizations, right? This classical ball game that both the Maya and the Highlands people played as both a sport and a worship ritual, in honor of the gods, kind of like the Olympics were for the classical Greeks. Was another way, right? This ball sport is fascinating, right? The winners became very wealthy and very highly respected within communities. The losers were sacrificed to the gods. So, if you think you've got a lot riding on the Super Bowl or your state soccer championship, just remember, if you lose the Super Bowl or if you lose to another high school at state, you're not going to be executed. So, they took these games very seriously. So again, this sport and warfare and these physical things were the means of social mobility within these civilizations. Political legitimacy, and remember, political legitimacy is who gets to be in charge. How do we figure out who gets to be in charge? Again, political legitimacy in these Mesoamerican cultures was based on heredity, right? You're the emperor because your father was the emperor. Also based on divine sanction, right? For the Mesoamericans, political power and religious power were the same thing, kind of like the medieval Catholic Church, as we're going to see in our next project. And so emperors and kings had to have the support of the priests in order to be powerful and politically legitimate. Government was by and large based on political alliances, particularly for the Maya. Right? The Maya were not a unified empire like the Aztecs. Rather, they were a collection of city-states that worked together. And sometimes City A and City B were allies against City C. And then sometimes, sometimes City B and City C were allies against City A. So we were constantly shifting political allegiances among these people, but it has formed a larger confederacy. Again, a lot like classical Greece. And the Highlands people, their political alliances and political structures, and once again, were built on these centralized tribute empires. So there was a top dog political state, and then there were a lot of subordinate political states around. The economic characteristics of the Mesoamerican peoples, again, they had these limited trade networks that were very rich and successful along short distances. And so because these city-states or tribute empires were fairly autonomous, there was a lot of trade going among these civilizations. But again, they have these geographic barriers. And later on, they would become very economically elitist, right, with very, very rich minority and then a very large majority of working class people. All right, Mayan literacy, as well as some of their neighbors, was based on these glyphs. And a glyph is a picture that stands for a word or an idea. So we see, the picture for Lord. So if you saw that picture meant Lord. Or if we saw, this other picture, it meant shield. And so their language was based on pictures. And so they strung together these glyphs to form sentences. And some of the glyphs represent concrete things like shield. Some of them represent abstract things like place. And so they were literate people, but their literacy was quite different from what we think of with our Roman alphabet and our phonetic system. Okay, and so that's it. Thanks for watching. Once again, make sure you complete your study guide and the online quiz, and use your SPICE graphic organizer to help you make sense out of these complex characteristics for a very complex people. Thank you.